Welcome back to One Piece Explained. Chapter 1117 brings us closer to the end of Vegapunk's message and the Egghead arc as a whole, but in classic Oda fashion, leaves us with more mysteries than answers. And in this breakdown, I'll be talking about the long-awaited return of a character that we haven't seen in over 25 years, why Diaz Drake's timeline does not make sense, a seemingly innocent mistake from Oda that could actually be a huge tell for Nusjuro's abilities, and of course, what Vegapunk was about to say before the message was cut off. If you end up enjoying this breakdown, be sure to like and subscribe so you can get more videos like this one as soon as they come out. And with that said, let's get into chapter 1117A. The chapter starts off with the 7th entry in the Ogre Child Yamato's Golden Harvest Surrogate Pilgrimage cover story, as we find Yamato paying a visit to the Yakuza in the Flower Capital. Here, Yamato gives a big hug to Cat Viper, who we last saw at the end of the Wano arc, alongside the rest of the Scabbards after having decided to stay behind on Wano, with Dogstorm to serve as Momonosuke's samurai, just as they did with Odin in the past. It seems Cat Viper has found himself quite comfortable in the midst of the Yakuza of the Flower Capital, matching his aesthetic quite a bit. We also see Hyogoro for the first time since the post-raid celebration, and recall that Hyogoro was a well-respected Yakuza boss in the Flower Capital, even commanding respect from the Yakuza bosses of the other regions, who I expect to see again once Yamato travels to those places. Though it is a bit unclear, it may be that Hyogoro has resumed his position as a Yakuza boss, since the Yakuza family that Kyoshiro had built up should no longer be around, but we'll have to see. Now on to the chapter. We pick back up with reactions from across the globe, once again returning to Fuloled. After Vegapunk disclosed that the Raja pirates knew the secrets of the world, we see the pirates on the island in an uproar over the possibility of sunken treasure. Now amongst this crowd are a few characters that may seem unfamiliar, but we know very well. After 25 long years, we finally have the return of the Krieg Pirates. All the way to the right is Don Krieg himself, brandishing his Jolly Roger on his large shoulder pads. It's unclear if his armor has been upgraded since we last saw it, but he does seem to be carrying what may be a pole arm on his back. This could be the handle of the battle spear he formed by clasping his shoulder blades together. A nice touch, as we had never seen the handle alone before this point in the series. His hair has grown out over the 2 years, which is actually a hairstyle that he had before we first saw him in the series, as he was depicted with longer hair in his bounty poster, though from the looks of it, his hair is even longer than that now. He's also sporting sunglasses, just like the man next to him, who is Gin. You can make out his iconic headband and the similar design of his jumpsuit as well. His hair has also grown out, and he appears to be now carrying a sword. It's unclear if he no longer uses the tonfa that we saw with him initially. Over to the left, cheering, you can spot Pearl, who seems to have actually upgraded his armor. Instead of shields that he strapped onto his limbs and holds in his hands, it seems his forearms now go through them, and it also appears he is now within a large cylindrical piece of armor, instead of attaching giant plates to the front and back of his torso. The cameo here is so subtle, and reminds me a lot of the Garp and Kobe and Helmeppo inclusion at the tail end of the Django cover story, with them just off walking to the side. It's very easy to miss Krieg and Gin, but I do like how Oda places Pearl, who has a very distinct silhouette and design, toward the center of the page to sort of draw the reader's attention and trigger that connection in your mind. This is honestly incredible, and perhaps even the highlight of the chapter for me. We last saw this group at the end of the Bratier arc, when Gin was taking Krieg, Pearl, and the rest of the defeated crew off of the Bratier. This would mean that the Krieg Pirates have had about 1,050 chapters between appearances, likely giving them the current record that I believe was just actually recently held by Roshio after his return just 2 chapters ago. This honestly may be the first time Oda has even drawn Krieg since the Bratier arc, as he wasn't present in that promotional color spread featuring the various antagonists in the live action, and I'm so glad he's back. I know the constant cutting to reactions around the world may have been tiresome for some readers, but I love that this is what's allowing Oda to check back in on characters from all across the story that we wouldn't really have any other reason to see once again. This gives me a lot of hope for other East Blue characters that we haven't seen in a while, such as Axe Hand Morgan, Kuro, and even Arlong, and I'd love to read about which characters you want to see back in the story down in the comments. Now, the Krieg Pirates being on Fuloled is a pretty big deal. First off, not only does it mean that they made it back to the Grand Line, but they actually made it to the New World. Recall that when we were introduced to them, the Krieg Pirates had returned from the Grand Line in shambles after having been decimated by Mihawk. Then, when the crew was defeated by Luffy, Gin was motivated to become a better pirate alongside Don Krieg, and it seems they have followed through. Though, I do have to wonder if they did it on their own merits or once again resorted to Krieg's trademark deception and trickery by stealing an unsuspecting ship. Krieg had also mentioned the first notion of a means to deal with devil fruit users in the series, which would eventually become realized as Sea Stone and much later on Haki. It would be pretty cool to see him decked out with his weaponry and armor in Sea Stone, and I wouldn't even be surprised if we were to come to find out that his crew has mastered some amount of Haki to get to where they are. And that's the other huge part of this. They are on Fololed, the home base of one of the Emperors of the Sea, Blackbeard. While it is possible that the Krieg pirates are merely passing by, I find it much more interesting if they have pledged their allegiance to the Blackbeard pirates as one of their subordinate crews, similar to how we saw with the Peachbeard pirates. Krieg at one point commanded 50 ships in his armada, and even planned to regrow his forces after they were destroyed, so I could definitely see Blackbeard take an interest in the sheer number of men that Krieg could offer. After all, Law did say that one of the best ways to survive in the New World was to get in on the good side of an emperor, like many of the supernovas did. And speaking of Law, recall that he took the hearts of 100 pirates from Fololed during the Rocky Port incident in order to become recognized as a warlord. It would be pretty interesting if Krieg and his men were amongst that group. This would put them in direct opposition to Law and also the Straw Hats, who Law was once affiliated with. Either way, Krieg being under Blackbeard puts them in direct opposition to the Straw Hats, which may prove interesting as the series moves towards its climax. That said, I do have to wonder if Gin has a soft spot for Luffy and Sanji, and how that will end up playing into things. If Garp is still alive on the island, perhaps there's some potential for Gin to want to help out Luffy's grandfather in some capacity, but that's just wishful thinking. Now, the Pirates of Fololed also explain how it would be very difficult for the average person to seek out anything submerged under the ocean, even if they knew about it, and with this, we get a quick look at some of the aquatic life under the sea. It's not completely clear if these mermaids are ones we have seen before, as we were able to recognize Ishili just a few chapters ago from the pattern on her tail. That said, the sea lion above the mermaids is quite familiar, as we first saw one back during the Fishman Island arc amongst the other sea beasts, and we last saw one during Jinbei's cover story. All of this talk about salvaging sunken treasure, of course, brings to mind the Monkey Mountain Alliance as we check back in on Mont Blanc Cricket, Masira, and Shoujo, along with some of the Uton divers in the back. It seems they've also been tuning into Vegapunk's message and are inspired by these new revelations. We had last seen these guys during the Decks of the World cover story, where it was said that they were now looking for the Island of Dreams, Nakroa. I wonder if that'll come into play at some point. There are also a few other places around the world in this chapter. None of them are particularly easy to identify and could just be places that we haven't seen before, but there is one later in the chapter that sort of resembles the Kano Kingdom with its architecture and mountains. If so, we did last see this country when we got the reactions to the global earthquakes earlier in the day. We then move to an island new to us as readers known as GS, which seems to be the medical marine branch. While the scene we get here is very similar to the aftermath of Marineford with Kobe in bed, this place should not be confused with the medical ward found in the former Marine HQ. It's here that we get the return of Sword, after having last seen its members escape from Fololed earlier this arc during the previous day. Kobe, Helmeppo, and Hibari seem to be the most wounded from the excursion, as Groose and Kujaku are in their typical outfits. They reflect on what everything means for them now, as Kujaku explains that their captain is doing well, which brings us to Diaz Drake, who we found out was the captain of Sword back during the Wano arc. We last saw him during the raid on Onigashima, immobile from his injuries besides Hawkins, though he was present in the Kuma flashback earlier in the arc, but of course, that took place years ago. Drake's presence at GS is a bit interesting, as Groose had said they still didn't have any contact with him as of yesterday, but there clearly is a transponder snail beside him here, imitating his appearance, which he could have used to get in touch with the rest of Sword. Now recall that it's been around at least 3 weeks since the end of the raid. For more on this logic, check out my 11/16 breakdown where I talk about it a bit more in detail. The Straw Hats and most of the other raid participants were relatively fine after a week or so, and especially by present day as we've seen throughout the Egghead arc. And not to get into power scaling, but I think most people would agree that Drake had it easier than several of the other combatants during the raid. All of this together suggests to me that Drake's injuries here may have come from something much more recent, and that he may have only checked into GS within the last day. But what could this have been? Perhaps he ended up saving Hawkins, allowing him the 1% chance of survival that he foresaw, only for Hawkins to betray him since he had found out Drake's cover, or something like that, who knows. One possibility that does interest me is Drake's interest in the world government's activities. Recall that during the Wano arc, Drake had discovered CP0's presence on Wano and reported this back to Kobe. Later on during the raid, when Drake confronted Cypherpole, Guernica attempted to take him out for realizing too much, and in a last-ditch attempt to stop him, Drake stabbed Guernica, which which prompted this very cryptic response from the CP0 agent. From this, it seemed that Guernica longed to be able to act on his own terms, but was unable to, as we saw when he was forced to follow his orders to interfere with the battle between Kaido and Luffy, resulting in him receiving Kaido's wrath. But in a potential last act of defiance, we would later learn that Guernica was the one who sent the picture of Luffy's bounty poster of him in Gear 5th, which had to have been taken after Guernica was felled by Kaido, implying that the CP0 agent may still be alive. So where am I going with all of this? Well, there was a clear subplot established during the Wano arc involving X-Drake trying to uncover and stop the world government's secret plans with Kaido. Because of this, there could have been more attempts on X-Drake's life, preventing him from getting in touch with the rest of Sword. Perhaps there's even some chance that he encountered Guernica once again, but on different terms, with Guernica having potentially been inspired to follow his own sense of justice. There's a lot of really interesting ways that this could go, and I'm looking forward to seeing where Oda takes this. Though, after all of the speculation, I should also point out how the reason why Drake was unable to make contact with the Sword all this time may have been something as simple as him being physically unable to speak, since he did receive a finger pistol to the throat during his fight against Guernica. But then again, he was able to vocalize everything during his exchange with Hawkins after the fact, so who knows. Anyways, it does seem like Drake was tuned into Vegapunk's broadcast, which further painted the world government in a questionable light. All of this, alongside his findings in Wano, would certainly serve to motivate Sword toward a certain direction, which may actually be what Kobe, Groose, and Kujaku were talking about in this chapter. Now, this brings us to an undisclosed part of the world, where we also get the return of Vice Admiral Smoker after over 300 chapters. It's kind of funny to say this, but I think this inclusion in this chapter would have had much more of an impact if it wasn't overshadowed by Don Krieg's reappearance after over 1,000 chapters later. But that just goes to show how great of a chapter that this is in its entirety. Now, we last saw Smoker recovering from his injuries from Punk Hazard at the tail end of Dressrosa, with him reacting to the news of Doflamingo's defeat. At the time, he was headed toward Egghead with Tashigi and the abducted kids from Punk Hazard in order to get them cured. Since then, we saw Tashigi join up with Sword to rescue Kobe, but we've yet to see what Smoker was up to. It's been almost a decade since Smoker was last in the story, only ever having been showcased in a few cover illustrations across the series since then. That said, we still don't really have a great idea of what he's been up to. We see him lugging some cargo across the ocean on his Billoware bike. This was first seen during Loketown and hasn't been used since the end of Alabasta, when it was tethered to the rainmaking ship that was operated by Baroque Works. That was when we first learned that it could be used to traverse the ocean, but it was such a small detail that this was later confirmed by Oda in the volume's 27 SPS. Now, it's not completely clear what he's hauling here. It looks to be a box or crate of some sort, and potential size and scale issues aside, it could even be a poneglyph. Who really knows at this point? Either way, I am interested to see what happens next with his character, as we are long overdue for some more Smoker. At the very least, it seems like he may reunite with Tashigi given his dialogue, but it's not clear if he's headed for GS or if he'll instruct her to meet him elsewhere. Also of note, it looks like it's nighttime in the part of the new world where Smoker is, suggesting that it's much further away from the Egghead side of things. Interestingly, Oda has also obfuscated the relative location of GS, depicting it in a rainstorm, making it hard to say if it's close to Egghead or Fuloled or any other island observing daytime. One last thing with the Marines is that we saw Sengoku and Suru headed somewhere in the previous chapter, and it was daytime in that stretch of sea. Of course, they were heading over from Marine HQ, where we know that it's currently nighttime, so it's really hard to say where they are actually going. Initially, people speculated that they may be actually sailing toward Fuloled, since they were likely prompted by Hina informing them Garp, Kujaku, and the rest of Sword were going there. But now that we see Sword at GS, perhaps they may wish to be headed towards that direction instead. Oda is really making it hard to say anything for certain, especially with the daytime and nighttime aspect at play, so I'm really looking forward to seeing what happens with this side of the Marines. Back over on Egghead, the Frontier Dome has finally been disabled by Stussy as per the plan. Though, as we speculated in the previous chapters, Nusjuro cutting the island cloud in half has stopped it from extending outward over the ocean, meaning if they propel themselves off the Labo phase now, they will be landing atop the ships on the coast. Also, in case anyone's wondering how the Labo phase is still up after Nusjuro sliced it in two, remember that this is still an island cloud, and it inherently has the properties to stay afloat in the sky, so long as the temperature conditions of the island are right. If something happens to the island AC, then everything may come crashing down, but it's in the Elder's brother's best interest to preserve the Labo phase, since both the power plant that produces the Mother Flame and Punk records are up there. Now, the original escape plan was for the Vega Force 1 to carry them over the ships so that they'll be able to use the coup de burst to get further away from the Marines. It's still to be seen how they'll be able to escape without trouble. Perhaps they can just land on the giant ship and Luffy will be able to give it the properties of rubber to prevent any damage, but we'll just have to see. Zoro and Jinbei are finally at the Sunny, though unfortunately with them is Nusjuro, who seems to have made his way to the Labo phase to take care of the Straw Hats, while the rest of the elders were informed to handle the transmission transponder snail in the Iron Giant. And with this, we get the long-awaited clash between Nusjuro and Zoro. Jinbei launches Zoro toward the elder with a new technique, though we have seen him use various sorts of shoulder throws across the series. This one looks to be a support technique though that propels Zoro forward, who himself is no stranger to being thrown through the air, as we've seen him do similar tandem maneuvers with Sanji's Armée de l'Air assault during the Davy back fight and Orlumbus's Commodore Killer Bowling back on Dressrosa. Through this, Zoro intercepts Nusjuro with an enhanced version of his two-sword style Rashomon technique that we've seen him use throughout the latter half of the pre-time skip arcs, having debuted during the journey to Enies Lobby when he split a train cart in two, and later on being used against the likes of Ryuma and Kuma. And with this clash, it seems both Nusjuro and Zoro identify each other's swords as being Kitetsu. We first learned about this group of blades back during the Logtown arc when Zoro first encountered his Sandai Kitetsu. The shop owner, Ippon Matsu, explained that the Kitetsu blades are considered cursed, causing death upon their users, and Tashigi explained how each Kitetsu is weaker than its predecessor, with Sandai Kitetsu being a fine great sword. We would later learn during the Wano arc that this was made by Sukiyaki, who was a descendant of Kotetsu, a famous blacksmith who forged the Nidai Kitetsu, classified as an excellent greatsword. We first saw the Nidai Kitetsu when Luffy borrowed it from Sukiyaki at the start of the Wano arc, and it was last seen returned to him after the liberation of Udon. For a long time, fans have speculated that Nusjuro was in possession of a Kitetsu as well, given how his blade's hilt is so similar to that of Zoro's Sandai Kitetsu, and after we saw the Nidai Kitetsu on Wano, it became apparent that Nusjuro likely held the Shodai Kitetsu, which is classified as a supreme grade sword. It's nice to have almost an explicit confirmation with this chapter after all of these years. While we may know who made the other two Kitetsu, the creator of the Shodai Kitetsu is still not clear. It would be very interesting if Nusjuro had made it himself, with him having been speculated to be a figure who has lived across the centuries, perhaps even predating Kotetsu. He is the one elder with a name that resembles the names found in Wano, and funny enough, even shares the Juro ending that Zoro used while on Wano. Perhaps Nusjuro was the predecessor of Kotetsu, making him a long-lost ancestor of the Kozuki clan. Very interesting possibilities at hand here. That said, there is something strange with this sword's appearance in this chapter. Notice how it lacks the handguard that we saw with it, not only in its debut, but its appearance just earlier a few chapters ago. Also, notice that the hilt is seemingly wooden here, matching the appearance of its scabbard. On one hand, this could just be an error on Oda's part that gets fixed in the volume version of the chapter, and he has made more obvious mistakes in the past that get corrected. That said, it is a very interesting error to have made, if it is one. It's almost as if he conceptualized the sword upside down or backwards, as if the sword was being drawn from the other end of the wooden scabbard. And maybe this is me just trying to rationalize something that just ends up being a simple mistake, but it would be very interesting if this was actually some sort of feature of the sword or Nusjuro's swordsmanship, if he could somehow draw it from the other end. Part of why I'm even considering this crazy idea is that the way Nusjuro is depicted unsheathing his blade here allows for that possibility. When he goes to attack the Sunny, he draws the sword with his left hand, seemingly taking off the top part of the scabbard, and when he clashes with Zoro, the blade is extending from what would be the scabbard, but it's in his right hand. And in the initial depiction of him drawing the blade, if the end that he pulls the sword from is the top of the scabbard, then the other end should have the hilt and the handguard that we're familiar with. But the hilt is obscured in shadow, and the position where the handguard should be is conveniently hidden behind his Hagoromo. I will fully admit that I could just be looking way too deep into this here, and this could easily just be an error, but at the same time, everything feels way too precise and intentional for it to be a simple mistake. What if Nusjuro is such a capable swordsman that he's able to draw his blade from either end somehow? After all, when we saw him use the Kitetsu against the Pacifista and initially against the Sunny, he was using his left hand, but against Zoro, he was able to block with his right. I'm interested to see if this actually becomes something of significance. Let me know what you think in the comments, as I am completely okay with just being wrong about this and it just being a mistake. Now, the clash between the two swordsmen is strong enough to force both of them back, but thankfully, Jinbei is there to catch Zoro. He informs Nami to get the ship going and that they'll be able to catch up somehow, but that does worry me. If Zoro and Jinbei are unable to get on the ship and are intercepted by Nusjuro, we may be looking at another crew split up ahead. Down on the northeast coast, the Giants are still holding off the Marine forces as we wait for Luffy, Dory, and Brogy to arrive. Nusjuro, having left for the Labo phase, means Bonnie's group is safe, although more and more Marines look to be attacking them. Recall that a few chapters ago, the Vice Admirals were instructed to converge on Bonnie, and it's with this that we see Hound and Urban order their forces to stop the Giants, two Vice Admirals that we haven't seen in a few chapters. We then get this amazing spread of the giant pirates holding back the Marines, making playthings out of them and their warships. The designs for the Giants are a lot of fun here, and most of these are new, but there are a couple that we may have seen before. The one with the beard and the beaded necklace looks to be the same one that we saw behind Oimo and Kashi when the crew first arrived. In front of him is a dark-haired giant with a separated mustache and metal bands around his forearm and bicep. This may be the same giant that we saw walking behind Dory and Brogy a few chapters ago, and in my 11:10 breakdown, I suggested that this may very well be the same giant that we saw back during the flashback on Little Garden, who was flexing behind his captains. Notice the similar metal band around the bicep. There's also a giant in the back in silhouette. This could just be a stylistic device to show that there's plenty more giants behind them, though it would be pretty interesting if this is supposed to be purposely obscured and it's someone in particular. We'll have to see if anything comes of this. Also, you may have noticed earlier in the chapter that the figurehead of the ship was restored, even though it was cut by Nusjuro just a few chapters ago. From this spread, we can see that they've managed to fix their figurehead by tying it in place with some rope, which I guess just goes to show how much pride they take in their symbols. And for clarity's sake, in a few of the other panels, you may have seen this structure, but note that this is actually the back of their ship. Bluegrass and Doll finally arrive after hijacking one of the sea beasts with Bluegrass's ride fruit, and she orders it to shoot a laser right into the hull of the giant ship. This would normally prove troublesome for a sailing vessel, but perhaps this is not that big of a deal because of just how large their ship is, meaning the hull may not be in a submerged part of the ship. We'll have to see. We also get Doll's first name technique, a series of armament hockey infused punches named after rock and roll music, which kind of plays into her aesthetic. Now, Doll's name can also be translated as Dole in reference to the dog-like animal, which would also work with her spiked collar and the rest of the Vice Admirals named after dogs, in which case her name would rhyme with the roll in rock and roll. Either way, this technique is enough to seemingly take down Kashi. This is fairly consistent though, as she had no trouble dealing with the pacifista earlier in this arc, once again proving how capable of a fighter she is. Now, while the Marines handle these giants, the rest of the Elders are seen handling the Iron Giant, giving us this terrifying panel of Jupiter, Saturn, Mars, and Mercury approaching the robot from the side. Interestingly, the Iron Giant takes no notice of the Elders, seemingly fixated toward his certain direction. It's unclear where exactly it's been trying to go, as every time we've seen it, we have not been given any other context to determine which side of the island it's facing. If I were to guess, I'd imagine it'd be looking toward the northeast coast, where Luffy has been moving towards. Another interesting bit is that the Elders seem to recognize the Iron Giant by its appearance, further evidencing the notion that the Elders have been around for centuries, since the robot had attacked Marijois 200 years ago and has been hidden on Egghead since then. Mercury's enraged at this revelation and charges toward it, knocking it off of its feet and seemingly damaging part of it as well, as you can see that one of the pipes on its back is crumbling. Once again, it's unclear just where the Iron Giant has been knocked back towards as it lands on one of the coasts, damaging several Marine ships in its wake. Wherever it may be, this does indeed end up cutting off the transmission across the world, much to many readers' dismay, I'm sure. That said, I don't think this is necessarily the end of the Iron Giant. The transmission transponder snail may have been knocked around, preventing it from transmitting the message, but that doesn't mean the Iron Giant can't get back up. I imagine it will continue to be a distraction for the Elders, which in turn would allow our protagonist to escape. Personally, I'm happy that we're not getting every single thing revealed here, and I'm even more interested in a new mystery that gets brought forth by the message being cut off, so let's talk about that. While Vegapunk ended the last chapter wondering why the Roger Pirates did not act on the true history that they held, he doesn't expound upon his thinking, and instead admits that he doesn't have much else to add to these points without bordering on speculation. Instead, his final message seems to be addressed to the people who hold the initial D. Of course, he gets cut off before specifying what exactly is relevant or present among them, and during this, we get a quick scene of every living person with the D, or at least someone to represent them, with Kobe standing in for Garp and Luffy, as well as Sabo standing in for his brothers. We also see Blackbeard for the first time since he defeated the Heart Pirates in the previous day, followed by Beppo calling out to Law, which could suggest that Law is indeed alive. Notably missing is of course Saul, who we recently learned to have been alive, though Oda has been intentionally holding off on showing his face just yet. Vivi is also not present, though she does react to the message being cut off alongside Morgans and Wapol. As far as we know, she would not be aware of her family bearing the D either. Now as for what exactly Vegapunk was going to say, it's a bit hard to speculate with confidence. In the Japanese text, the final utterance he leaves off on is mo, which could realistically be any number of things. A popular idea is that he was about to utter a phrase along the lines of mohitori, which to my understanding roughly means another person. This would perhaps mean Vegapunk is trying to convey that there is another special figure among those who bear the D, which many of course would speculate to be Blackbeard. After all, among the photos and bounty posters cut up by Emu, Blackbeard is the only one so far who does not have a Void Century analog, with Luffy's being Joy Boy, Shirahoshi's being the Ancient Mermaid Princess, and Vivi's being Lily. We did recently learn that Blackbeard has some sort of special bloodline or lineage, so that may check out. Some people may also speculate that Vegapunk was going to speak on there being a fake D among the group, a popular theory that has been around ever since Whitebeard told Blackbeard that he was not the one Roger was waiting for. There's also a decent chance that Vegapunk was just going to utter a different word or name that we wouldn't necessarily be able to think of. No matter how it goes, I'm just excited that we still have such a big mystery ahead of us going into the final years of the series. It felt like with so many big things starting to get addressed, we may be rushing towards a conclusion and an info dump with this broadcast, but I'm glad that there are still things to think about and speculate on week to week, as that's what I enjoy the most about the series, being able to participate in the community discussions every chapter. That said, I do think it's possible that the broadcast resumes. While the transponder snail inside the Iron Giant is meant to be broadcasting the message, it's not the actual feed itself, meaning the message is likely still playing, and if the snail ever wakes back up or is restored, then whatever is left of the message may continue to be transmitted. I doubt it would be able to go back to the part that was cut out, but we may get some last words from Vegapunk in some capacity. Also, a big deal was made about allowing people to see the broadcast, yet we haven't really had that come into play. I suppose it did allow for people to see that the time on Egghead was inconsistent with what it would be currently, proving that this was indeed pre-recorded, and perhaps Vegapunk wanted to show the world him bowing when apologizing, but I wouldn't be surprised if there's still something relevant that has not been shown just yet. We've been talking for weeks about how the snail is the same one that we saw in Film Red to allow live streams, so perhaps we could see something where the snail comes to and starts broadcasting the current status of the island, maybe even unintentionally. We'll just have to see. The last quick bit I want to address is how this chapter ends on York, relieved that everything is over. There's still that lingering mystery of how Vegapunk was able to figure out the government's plans while making himself unaware of what was going on from the last chapter, and I posit some potential explanations for that in that breakdown. I'm still very interested in getting some closure for that strange plot point. While it does look like we're finally wrapping up the Egghead arc, there are still some unfinished threads like this one that I hope will get addressed soon. I do imagine that the Iron Giant is what occupies the Elders, allowing the Straw Hats to escape, but there's still the whole bit about Kizaru's potential guilt over hurting and killing his friends. Perhaps his parting gift for the Straw Hats will involve assisting them to make their final escape. While he may not stand against the Elders directly, he would have the authority to order the Marines to stand down, much like Kuzan ordered the Buster Call fleet at Enies Lobby to stop when the Straw Hats made their escape on the Going Merry. Anyways, that's about it for what I had to say on this chapter. There was a ton to talk about, and I can't wait to see what you all thought about the chapter in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe so you can get more of my manga breakdowns as soon as they come out. Thank you so much for watching, stay safe, and I hope to see you in the next one.